Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. This is Horror Trans. This is my Horror Trans podcast. I am a transgender woman who talks about all things horror. And if you're familiar with the show, I run down what I've been watching recently, go through some horror news and rumors, and then have a few topics for you for discussion. So recently I only watched two movies last week. Um, Friday the 13th, Part 3. And yesterday I watched Friday the 13th Part 4. Um, I was kind of busy with work stuff and video stuff. A lot of stuff I don't want to get into right now. So I didn't really have a lot of free time to watch movies, unfortunately. I do plan on watching Spookies for my next Patreon bonus commentary. This movie has been recommended to me multiple times by a handful of people. So I'm going to finally dive in and check it out. So if you want to um, watch along as I talk about spookies, go to patreon.com/Stephanie Bree, and you know, you can get that. I try to do one Patreon bonus commentary a week, but realistically, I only promise one a month. Um, but I try to do one a week, and I know I kind of advertise one a week, but I try to make it clear that the expectation is you'll get one a month, just like my Ask Me Anythings. But I try to do one a week, so I want to put that out there because some weeks I get busy and I just don't have time to do it. All right, let's jump into news and rumors. I only have three articles today, not a lot jumped out at me. First article comes from Bloody Disgusting. This one's a sad one. This is voice actor Mark Dodson, who did a lot of voices for the Gremlins movie, has passed away. So, according to Bloody Disgusting, he was also a voice actor on Star Wars. He was 64 years old. Um, he played Salacious Crumb in Return of the Jedi, and also did some zombie voices for George Romero's Day of the Dead. And he voiced multiple Gremlins in Gremlins and Gremlins 2, The New Batch. It doesn't look like, I mean, according to this article, anyways, I haven't looked at his IMDb, but it doesn't look like he's done much else aside from some voice acting. He did dozens of movies, video games, commercials, and advertisements, blah, blah, blah. He had a daughter and some grandchildren, apparently. So he unfortunately passed away. I believe it was yesterday. So that's some sad news. Also coming from Bloody Disgusting, Jason Blum is trying to get a Friday the 13th movie. Um, the Blumhouse recently Blumhouse. I'm not sure how you say it. Bloom, whatever. Rebooted the Halloween franchise a few years ago, and it was, I would say, financially successful. I don't know if I would say it was commercially. I mean, not commercially, but I mean critically successful. I don't know. I wasn't a big fan of him, but um, he does want James Wan to be involved. It doesn't say what his role would be, possibly director. It says Friday the 13th is not a Bloomhouse project, but I'm trying to will it into being one. It's just a piece of IP I've always loved. Da 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 da. Okay. So it's not really news. Let's file this one more under rumors, but it's actually just something he wants to do, but realistically, not likely. So let's not get excited for it. And just a small tidbit coming from horrorbuzz.com. They are announcing that Dracula 1944 comic book is on Kickstarter. It is a comic book that will feature the famous vampire Dracula terrorizing Nazis during World War II, it looks like. Fundraising goal is $750. The Kickstarter ends on March 30th. And does it say when it'll come out? Presumably, if it gets funded. I'm trying to see. I don't see anything else. It looks like it's just rambling about the project. Let's click on the Kickstarter and see what it says. Maybe they have a timeline. let's see. US $1,200 pledged of US 750 goal. So it's met its goal. 44 backers, 26 days to go. So it has been funded. All right, so la di da. Let's see if there's a timeline. I'm not seeing. It says rewards, logo, T-shirt, vinyl stickers, coffee mug, foil art, blah blah blah. Oh, it's expected to come out mid-March, so this month, like really soon. Okay, so it's been funded and it's coming. It's coming very soon. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Dracula 1944. Okay, all right. That's all I have for news and rumors. Um, this week's topics are going to be a little iffy, but let's see if we can power through it. First topic is teenagers in horror. Now, we all know the slasher trope of teens do bad things, they get killed by the boogeyman. This has been brought to light. It was a trope throughout the 80s, but it was brought to light in Scream 1996 and has been spoofed and commentated on pretty much a bajillion times since then, um, including in subsequent Scream films and even in legacy sequels, reboots, requels, etc., of franchises that made the trope popular in the first place. But there's one thing I've noticed about teenagers as depicted in especially slasher films. When we can talk about teenagers in like family films or haunted house movies like um, 12-year-old Linda Blair, who's almost a teenager, Reagan in The Exorcist, and the teenage daughter in Poltergeist are two that come to mind. Outside of slashers and those two references, I can't think of a bunch of horror movies that feature teenagers. Again, like I said, outside of slashers. They have young, I guess I would say preteen and early teen characters in the Conjuring films. Whereas the characters in the Conjuring films, at least the kid characters, are relatively inconsequential to the story. They're like, there and they're part of the horror, the things that are happening to the family, but they don't really contribute to the outcome of the films. So they're just sort of set pieces. Now in slasher movies, you have two things that I've noticed. The first thing that I've noticed, well, at least two, but maybe more will pop in my head. You have teenagers that are played by mid-20s to early 30s actors, which are not teenagers. Now, this is common in Hollywood, especially in the 80s and 90s. Um, child labor laws and things like that made it difficult to get actual teenagers. And there was, for a time, society, American society in particular, had this aversion to teenagers. It was like, as a culture, we just wrote teenagers off as, subhuman creatures and didn't want to deal with them. Now, later decades, more recent times, movies and TV shows have done a better job hiring actual teenagers to play teenagers, not necessarily in horror. And one of the reasons why you don't have a lot of teenagers in horror films, especially slashers in particular, is because you tend to have a lot of nudity in slasher movies. And you can't really depict underage children nude because, child laws, child porn laws and things like that, which is a good thing. We don't want to see, 16-year-olds taking their shirts off. I mean, you shouldn't want to see that, I should say. Because they're not full-grown adults yet. If you're 16 and your girlfriend or partner or whatever wants to show you her tits, that's between you and her. Nobody's business. Just don't post pictures of it to the internet, please. But we don't need to see it in movies. The other thing you'll notice in, especially, again, going back to slasher movies with the teenagers, is they almost always, as in like 98, 97% of the time, are attractive. Like good-looking kids. I say 97, 98% of the time, because you have occasional stragglers, like Shelly from Friday the 13th Part 3, or the infamous Franklin in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But for the most part, you're talking about fit, physically fit, fairly attractive, pretty good-looking kids, male and female. This is the trope. Again, because more often than not, they're going to be depicted as having sex or doing sexual stuff or hitting on each other. A lot of times they're going to be smoking weed or doing other drugs. Usually it's weed, but occasionally it'll be other drugs. But that's rare. A lot of times there's alcohol use, which again, you're talking about teenagers. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, it was illegal. Marijuana was illegal for everybody, everywhere. But alcohol was definitely illegal for teenagers, especially teenagers with no adult supervision at a summer camp. That would have not been acceptable. Also, even if Jason and or Pamela Voorhees didn't show up to murder the teenagers in Friday the 13th, those teenagers getting drunk would have probably died in boating accidents, or they're often depicted as shooting bows and arrows at the camp. Somebody was going to shoot an arrow through somebody's temple. That's dangerous. Mixing alcohol and sharp objects is not smart. So those kids were probably destined to die anyways. But let's just be fair. And now I know I'm specifically talking about Friday the 13th, but we see a lot of teenagers throughout the 80s slasher movie craze, especially. Again, outside of slashers, you don't usually get a lot of teenagers for some reason. You get a lot of creepy kids, like preteen and younger, like The Sixth Sense, The Ring, Poltergeist was another example that I've already mentioned. You have the two kids who I think are preteen in Jurassic Park. They definitely don't look teenagers to me. Maybe 13 at the oldest. Maybe. But I'm not going to go that far. I don't know how old or young the actors playing those kids were, but let's just say they're probably not full-blown teenagers. So most examples of teenagers are in slasher movies. Even Tremors. You have one older kid, the jackass, I can't remember his character's name. And then you have the little girl on the pogo stick. Again, little girl. So mostly what we have to look at are slashers. Now, the most prominent slasher franchises that feature teenagers really heavily are A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, Friday the 13th, somewhat Halloween, although Halloween is iffy. Again, there's a little girl in a couple of the Halloween movies. Actually, there's a little girl in the first Halloween too. Uh, Lindsay Ellis and what's his name? The little boy. I forgot his name. He's like a major character, and I can't remember his name. He's a main character in Curse of Michael Myers and comes back as a plot point in Halloween Kills. Tommy Tommy Doyle. There it is. I knew it would come back to me. He was pretty young. So was I forget her name. The little girl from Halloween 4 and 5. I forget her name right now. The actress as well as the character. Allegedly Michael's niece, depending on which timeline you're following, I guess. But you do have a lot of teenagers, but you also have a lot of adults. So let's just look at the three big franchises. We'll ignore the one-offs like My Bloody Valentine, Pieces, Slumber Party Massacre, which I guess had a couple of sequels. We'll focus on the three franchises. So let's look at Nightmare on Elm Street first. Um, the first movie are decidedly teenagers. They're still in high school. They are somewhat sexually active. We know Rod and Tina are sexually active. We know that Glenn is horny, but Nancy is cold to Glenn in that regards. We do not see any of the kids doing drugs in that movie, but we do see them acting as typical teenagers, having a slumber party, you know, going to school, fighting with their parents, watching MTV in the bedroom, etc. You know, doing things teenagers would do. We see this again, sort of, in Freddy's Revenge. Although what we see in Freddy's Revenge is a little different because, whereas I would argue the kids in Nightmare on Elm Street are middle class. Aside from Jesse, the kids in Freddy's Revenge are upper middle class. Not quite high society, but not poor by any means. They're kids with whose families have money. This is well established in the movie. So what we're seeing these kids do is not typical teenager behavior because rich kids do not behave the same way as poor kids because they have, they got money. They can do things poor kids can't. So they live a decidedly different lifestyle. Nightmare on Elm Street 3, what we see are a bunch of troubled kids in a mental institution. So we're not seeing a lot of typical teenage behavior here. What we're seeing is traumatized kids who are desperate to survive their trauma and failing miserably at that attempt. So these teenagers do not fall under the typical teenager camp. In Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, we're back to typical, suburban, I'll say suburban middle class kids again. Not really poor, although Alice and Rick's family might be poor because, single dad, one income. Definitely not, upper, middle class like Kristen and, possibly Joey and Kincaid, although we don't see enough of Joey and Kincaid's home life to be able to get a measure of their money. We can assume Joey comes from wealth, or at least, middle class, middle income, based on he was the leader of the debate club, and he looks like, he dresses like he has money. At least in Dream Warriors, he does. Not so much in Dream Master, but, he's slumming it, I guess, in Dream Master. But again, we see teenagers doing typical teenage behavior. We see this again, kind of, in The Dream Child, but we are seeing kids who have just graduated high school who are shifting from childhood to adulthood. So what we're seeing is kids that are, struggling with no longer being kids, safety of their parents' homes, trying to, find their way into the real world. There are no kids, hardly to speak of, in Freddy's Dead because he's already killed them all. That's a plot point of the movie. But what we, again, like Dream Warriors, we see troubled kids. These are kids staying at a, I believe, youth center or homeless shelter. It's not very clear. Um, Again, kind of exhibiting more stereotypical behavior, not necessarily common kid behavior. They are definitely tropes in this movie. By and large, I would say for the most part, the teenagers in the Elm Street movies are fairly accurate representations of what teenagers would have behaved like in the 80s, just based on my limited experience being a kid in the 80s. Let's talk about the Halloween movies. Um, these are not stereotypical teens. These are adults dressed up like teens. They act like adults. They're way more mature than normal teenagers, with the exception being the stepsister, half sister, whatever. I forgot her name in Return of Michael Myers. She's kind of a bratty, teeny bitch. The rest of them are just like adults, not just adult actors dressed up like teenagers, but it's almost like they forgot how to act like teenagers. So we don't see a lot of typical teen behavior in the Halloween movies. We see kids going to the hardware store. We see kids, going to work. We see kids, you know, um, yeah, cruising around town, walking around town. That's, anyone can do that, I guess. Babysitting, sure, why not? But again, it's a lot of supposedly teenagers doing more adult looking stuff than what you would expect teenagers to be doing. So I would rank the teenagers as depicted in the Halloween franchise as not very realistic. Um, Now, I'm not just saying this because I'm not a fan of the Halloween franchise. I'm just being overly critical because that's what I do. Now let's talk about the Friday the 13th films. Because Jesus Christ, there's a lot of fucking kids in these movies. There's at least 35 victims between Halloween or Friday the 13th, 2, 3, and 4. That's a lot of fucking kids. A handful of adults, 5 or 6 adults between those 3 films, but a lot of fucking teenagers meet their maker in those movies. Friday the 13th, we see a bunch of camp counselors. These are not teenagers. These are grown adults, early 20s, college age kids doing college age stuff. We can, write this off. These are not necessarily teenagers. Friday the 13th, part 2, same thing. Again, these are college age kids doing college age things. We see them going to a bar, to a casino, drinking, gambling, doing things that teenagers would not legally be able to do without a fake ID. It is unclear of the age of the kids in Friday the 13th, part 3. They could be teenagers on a summer vacation, or they could be college age kids again. It's not made known in the movie. We do know that they all can drive, they all have vehicles and driver's licenses. And we do see them drinking in the movie. Again, teenagers do and can drink, not legally, but they do it anyways, especially in horror movies. Um, Things get muddier from there. Now, the teenagers in Friday the 13th, Part 3, or I shouldn't even say teenagers, the characters in Friday the 13th, Part 3, none of them, not even the adults, behave like real people. These people behave like horror movie tropes. They're there to die. That's it. They have no personality, no characterization. You have the jackass, you have the bitch, you have the jock. They're literally just, carbon fucking cardboard cutouts. This continues, and I'm not going to go film by film. This pretty much continues through the rest of the franchise, the one exception being Jason Lives, where for the first time, you not only have actual children at the summer camp, which we've never seen in any of the films before, but again, you have, I would say, late high school age children as the counselors, because the 2 adult counselors definitely look college age, but the others definitely come off as teenagers. So this would be the first film in the entire franchise where the teenagers are supposed to be teenagers, even though, once again, they're played by fucking grown ass adults. However, these kids come across as believable kids, you know. I skipped over the troubled kids in A New Beginning because, again, these are mentally unstable kids in a mental health facility. They're not going to be accurate portrayals of real kids. And I'm skipping over the final chapter because those kids are fucking obnoxious. And the only kid in the movie is Corey Feldman, who I believe is playing his real age, 12 years old, thereabouts. Everybody else is either late teens or, again, possibly early 20s. It's unclear. We do know that the kids in Jason Takes Manhattan, air quotes, takes Manhattan, takes a boat to Canada is more accurate, but whatever. Um, they're high school graduates, so those are teenagers. Again, acting as high school graduates would. They're ready to take on the world. I don't know what age group the actors or characters in A New Blood are supposed to be. It's unclear in the movie, and just based on their behaviors and based on the fact that there's no adult supervision at all, um, I'm going to probably chalk them up to college age kids again. So, again, here we have another franchise where the trope is a serial killer murders a bunch of teenagers where we don't actually have teenagers. Again, it's a misconception. There are very few actual teenagers, and I don't just mean actors playing teenagers, but characters depicted as teenagers in the Friday the 13th films. Even though everyone just assumes it's Jason murdering teenagers, it isn't. They're adults. They're young adults, but they're still adults. So the question then is, where does this trope of the serial killer murdering teenagers come from when none of the big slasher franchises have actual teenagers in them? I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't say none, but by and large, they really don't. So this isn't a trope. It's a misconception. People call it a trope, but it actually isn't accurate. I just wanted to point that out because as I have been going through slashers, I've noticed that there really aren't as many teenagers in these movies as you would think, considering that the assumption is they're all teenagers when they're really not. So there is that. Next topic is sort of related to something I brought up in the last topic. This is the early 2000s horror remake revival. So, starting in, I would say, 2001, 2002, we saw, especially from Platinum Dunes, a shit ton of remakes of classic horror movies. Now, the um, trend continued pretty much on into this day, but it's wound down quite a bit. There was a time where every movie announced was either a remake or a legacy sequel, which some of those legacy sequels could have served as remakes anyways, or reboots, especially Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, which A Nightmare on Elm Street was a remake, but Freddy vs. Jason as a legacy sequel serves more as a reboot than a proper sequel, considering it ignores the events of the last three or four films and both franchises and just makes it up as it goes. Again, another movie where they're supposed to be teenagers, not to harp on that, but they're really not. Well, let's move aside from that. All right. So the early 2000s, we had two trends. Trend number one was we saw a lot of classic horror movies remade. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, The Amityville Horror, Black Christmas, etc. It was just like one after a fucking another. This was pretty common and pretty prevalent, and most of these movies were fairly or moderately successful, successful enough that the studios kept churning them out. Um, the second remake trend we saw in the early 2000s was localizing East Asian and South Asian horror films, mostly from South Korea and Japan, and remaking them for American audiences or Western audiences. Um, this was a short lived trend. It started with The Ring and more or less ended with The Grudge. So it wasn't even really a trend, it was just a blip. There were like a couple of movies that did this, And then we pretty much said, all right, enough is enough, and moved on. And then Eli Roth came on the scene, and horror took a fucking nosedive in quality when that happened. My question is, are any of the early 2000s horror remakes any good? Setting aside the American localizations of the Asian films, because those were pretty good. The Ring is pretty good. The Grunge is watchable. I'm not going to say good, but watchable. You know, it's got its issues, but I'm not going to get into it. Um, so I'm not going to run down the entire list because I haven't seen them all, but I'm going to touch on the ones I have seen and the ones I like. So the first one is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2003. Jessica Biel and a whole bunch of CW soap opera actors who have either gone on to be CW soap opera actors or fallen into obscurity, rightfully so, because none of them could act to save their lives. Which in the film, they don't save their lives, so, there is that. Because they all die. Um, I think the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a damn good movie. And I've said this before, I actually like it better than the 1974 Tobe Hooper original. Now, I do think the Gunnar Hansen Leatherface is a more effective Leatherface than what we see in 2003. However, I think 2003 is a scarier movie. It's decidedly gorier, and I would argue more effective because it leaves you scarred with images you can't erase, whereas the original leaves it all up to your imagination and you can picture whatever you want. I mean, you could picture those kids survive if you wanted, because we don't see any on screen deaths or definitive proof of death in that movie, except for maybe Franklin, who's the only one we can definitively say 100% died. The rest of them, in your head canon, if they lived, they lived. You can't, no one can tell you they didn't. Next up, we have The Hills Have Eyes. Now, this is another one where I'm going to argue the remake is better than the original. Um, this is rare, and a lot of people disagree with that, but I think this one is more effective because the cannibals in this movie, um, they're not as brutal as the cannibals in the original, I will say, but there's a consistency to their characters that is missing in the original. They're just sort of, oh, they're cannibals, so they're going to kill us. But this one, they kind of have a better motivation. And, you know, again, nobody fucking survives this movie. But you're left with uh, you're left with the trauma of experiencing what these people go through. Which, having seen both, I would say I do prefer the remake. I have not seen the Amityville remake, and I have not seen the Last House on the Left remake. Now, the Last House on the Left is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and it's Dream Team, Sean S. Cunningham, and Wes Craven working together for the only time in their career that they would work together collaboratively, you know. And it's, you know, tonally, it's a confusing movie, but it's fucking effective. It's very scary. So, to that end, I don't want to see the remake because I think the original, in this instance, stands well enough on its own. I didn't watch the original thinking, all right, that was good, but it could be better. When I watched the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, my first instinct is, that was good, but it could be better, you know? And I would argue to this day, I will contend that House of a Thousand Corpses is the best Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, even though it's not a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. I have not done a proper review of the Friday the 13th, 2009 yet for my Horror Trans channel. So I will not talk about it here. However, I have reviewed A Nightmare on Elm Street. And I'll kind of repeat what I said in that video. I enjoyed it for being a different take on the lore. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite movie of all time, and I do not watch that movie and think it could be better. I watch that movie and I think, holy shit, he knocked it out of the park the first time. It's all downhill from here, and it pretty much was. The remake, on the other hand, basically just gives us an alternative take on the story. Going back to the characters for a second, are they believable? I have to say I don't know, because I wasn't in high school in 2010. I don't know what teenagers were like in 2010. So I can't say definitively if those teenagers are accurate to what teenagers in 2010 would have been like. Definitely not accurate to teenagers in the 90s when I was a teenager. But this movie wasn't made in the 90s, so I can't say definitively. Is it a good movie? Actually, yeah, it is. Is it a well-received movie? No, it isn't. I understand the issues people have with this movie, and I would be, or should be, inclined to agree with them, considering the original is my favorite movie of all time. I just, well, I love Freddy Krueger, and I'm all about seeing alternative takes on Freddy Krueger. I'm still hoping for another remake or reimagining where we either get Elijah Wood is my top pick for Freddy Krueger, and if he can't or won't do it, get fucking Kane Hodder to do it. God damn it, give him a shot. Let him put on the glove and the makeup, and let's see what his Freddy Krueger looks like, because he sucks balls as Jason, and I don't give a fuck what anybody says. But he's a damn good Victor Crowley, so we know he can, be an effective killer if given the right tools, which, putting him in fucking Jason Takes a Boat to Canada is not the right tools. I'm glad, I'll say it, he wasn't Jason in Freddy vs. Jason, because then I can say he only played Jason in the 4 worst films in the franchise. 5 notwithstanding, because that wasn't technically Jason. So again, it didn't fucking matter. I don't have any other examples of early 2000s horror remakes, because by and large, I mostly avoid them. I haven't seen the Hitcher remake. I haven't seen the Amityville remake. I haven't seen the Poltergeist remake, which the Poltergeist I will never watch, because the original Poltergeist fucking scared me fucking shitless. I'm not going to watch what has been described as a scarier take on an already scary movie. I don't think so. I'm good. I don't need to see that. And I haven't seen the remake of The Exorcist, which The Exorcist is already a scary enough movie as it is, and it's been redone or retold or whatever, reimagined so many times. I don't need to see another version of the or telling of The Exorcist. I'm good. Now there are lesser known remakes of this era that I'm skipping over because, again, I haven't seen them, or I have no interest in them, or I probably just forgot them because they were lesser known. Now, there's one more I want to mention just because it somehow, even though the original was a one off, the remake spawned a franchise. It got sequels. And that is I Spit on Your Grave. Now, I've already shat on this movie previously, the original. This movie is not worth a fuck. It's not worth talking about or mentioning or reviewing or watching or anything else. Hell, it ain't even worth acknowledging its existence. So, to that end, I will never watch the remake or any of its spin-offs or sequels or whatever. I don't need to see that movie again. I've already seen it once. No thanks. I wish I hadn't seen the original. I don't have anything else I can say about the early 2000s horror remakes other than they're out there. It's an alternative take on, slashers and etc. from the 70s and 80s. Some of them work, some of them don't. It's up to you to decide which ones do or don't. Because I'm not going to watch hardly any of them. I've already seen the ones that I had an interest in, and the rest of them, no thanks. I'll pass. I'm definitely not going to watch a remake of a movie I didn't like. Um, so I will not be watching the Hitcher remake because the original Hitcher was a piece of rubbish, and I don't need to watch that movie again. There is one more I want to briefly touch on before I go to my next topic, and that is When a Stranger Calls. This is one where When a Stranger Calls, the remake, is nothing like the original. It's When a Stranger Calls in name only, which is not necessarily a remake, but a reimagining, a retelling of the same story. I would argue the original is way more effective, but the remake is watchable. It's worth a watch. Um, I'll probably rewatch it before I review it because I'm a little fuzzy on the details. And I'll definitely rewatch the original because I enjoyed it a lot. The first time I watched it, I was blown away. I was like, holy shit. You know, I didn't think they could make good horror movies in the 70s. I was wrong. I was under the impression that horror movies didn't get good until the 80s. Um, so, my next topic is going to be very brief because we're getting low on time and I want to get on to the um, media franchise of this episode. But the question is Doom, the video game, the famous first-person shooter from id Software, a horror game or not? I have seen this debated on the internet endlessly. People arguing both sides. It's just a first-person shooter, or it is a horror game, whatever. Now, is the Doom franchise a horror franchise? No, absolutely not. The subsequent Doom video games are decidedly action shooters. They're just shoot the fucking place up with, just spray bullets until you get a game over. That's all they are. That's literally all they are. Nothing notable about the sequels. However, the original Doom, one, it does have the horror atmosphere. You're in hell fighting demons. I mean, more or less. I mean, it's supposed to be a military compound that opened a door to hell, I guess. So you have scientists, allegedly, that you have to shoot down because they're the bad guys for opening the door to hell. And then you have the monsters that are coming out of hell, which again, why would, bullets kill demons? I don't know. But I guess it works. Um when I was a kid, the first time I played Doom, just the music, the lighting, the atmosphere, everything, it didn't feel horror to me. It didn't. Um, I didn't play Doom and think this is a horror game. I played Doom and I thought this is just a better Wolfenstein 3D. Um, as a kid, I thought Wolfenstein 3D was pretty fucking dope because I hadn't played anything like it. And when it came out, I was like blown away. But then when I played Doom, Wolfenstein 3D felt so primitive and trivial. I was like, yeah, no, Doom is where it's at. Um, Having gone on to not become a fan of the first person shooter genre, excuse me, very few first person shooters have actually appealed to me. I would say personally, I'm not a fan of any FPS franchise. The original Doom stands out in my mind because it's pretty much a classic and it's a staple. It wasn't the literal first person shooter, but it is the one that put FPS games on the map, made the genre popular. Um, it defined what a first person shooter should look, feel, and play like. And to that end, I don't think it's very horror to me, it just comes off as a mindless action game where you just happen to be shooting monsters. So, in Halo it's aliens, in Wolfenstein it's Nazis, in Call of Duty it's, bad guys, whoever the US military defines as bad guys. And in Metroid it's space mutants? Question mark. So, no, I don't think, fear notwithstanding, the first person shooter is a genre that's very effective at telling horror stories. Fear is a totally different ball game, but we're not talking about fear, we're talking about Doom. So my answer to the question is Doom horror? My answer is no. I don't think so. So that's my stance, and I'm going to stand by it. Let's talk about American Horror Story. This is the TV show that I've had a lot of people request me watch, and I have seen, I would say, enough of it to have an opinion of, but not enough of it to be able to say I've seen it all, because I won't. Because what I've seen of it, I was not a fan. So, American Horror Story, I have two problems with it. Problem number one, it's a television show, which means you can't really do the kind of horror I'm looking for in a TV show. You just can't. It needs to be a movie. Um, because the kind of horror I want is a 90-minute get in, get out, body count, scare me if you can. If not, I'm good. Give me the blood, give me the gore. I don't need, you know, a lecture. I don't need, social commentary. I'm not going to be dismissive of social commentary, but I just want the fucking kills. I'm more into slashers than anything. American Horror Story is, I would say, I'm not going to use the word elevated horror because I don't like that, but I will say it's too highbrow for me. I don't I don't like highbrow horror. The second issue I have with American Horror Story is the inconsistency in the canon, in the mythology. It's basically a horror anthology, which I've repeatedly said multiple times over, I am not a fan of. I do not like anthology stories. I can't follow American Horror Story because there's no fucking story. It's a whole new setting and characters and world and everything else every season. It's its own thing, and I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I'd love Stranger Things because there's a continuity there. I want a continuity. There is no continuity in American Horror Story. It's one-offs, and I don't like it. It's not the kind of horror I'm into. So, I'm going to respectfully request, please stop asking me to watch American Horror Story, because I ain't. I've seen enough of it to know it is not my bag. It ain't for me. That's all I have for this week. Hopefully we get some more news coming out of next week. Um, Not very newsy this week, and maybe, hopefully, this week I'll get a chance to watch some more movies than I did last week because I just didn't have a lot of time last week. So hopefully we'll see. That's all I have. You know how to find me online. Stay cool.